Good morning, everyone. I am Henry Millets, and I will be your service leader for today as we continue our weekly Sunday services online on Zoom. This service is being recorded except for joys and sorrows, which will not be recorded. Let's take a moment to review the Zoom control buttons for audio mute, the little microphone on your screen, and stop video, the little video camera on your screen. The buttons should be around the edge of your screen, often at the bottom. When there's a red line through the microphone or camera, audio or video are off, but not permanently. Click the button again and the audio or video will return. Thanks to Zoom, we see each other. Members of our tech staff are constantly viewing the Zoom gathering as well. Remember that we can see you and what is around you unless you stop your video. We can hear you and the sounds around you unless you are muted. Please stay muted unless we are in part of the service when I ask you to unmute yourself. Also remember that there is a chat feature that you can use to communicate by text with others present. Please locate that button. You can click the button, then type your message into the box. When you hit the return key, the message will be sent and shown in the box. You may wish to use the chat box to share a joy or sorrow, which you can begin to do now, or to make a donation to UUCLC later when we ask for donations and post the link in the chat box. You can change who receives the message by clicking the little caret in the box next to everyone and selecting the recipient. Finally, you can change who you see on the screen by clicking the different view buttons. The button with 4 squares in it is the gallery view, and clicking on that lets you see everyone at once. There will likely be more than one page of faces for the gallery view. So for announcements this morning, I have 3. First, the congregational meeting will take place here on Zoom immediately following the service. The meeting will present the proposed annual budget. That seems very important, so all members should probably plan to remain online for that. Second, members of the Social Justice and Environment Committee will again be in the church driveway from 11:30 to 12:30 this Thursday, September 10th, to receive contributions of items for Lake Cares Food Bank and Open Door Homeless Center. Note that the time is a half hour earlier than the past 2 times. Third, the 5th program in the Social Justice Online Lecture Series will take place next Sunday, September 13th at 7 o'clock on Zoom. Attorneys Bridget Bennett and Deborah Townsend will speak on the topic, which immigration policies hurt our families and our economy? Please register in advance using the link provided in the weekly bulletin or on the UUCLC website or the Facebook page. Now, does anyone else have any announcements at this time? If so, please wave your hand and someone will call on you. And I can't see the hands, so I'll just wait. All right, no announcements. All right. Let me introduce our guest speaker today, who is Dan Gribbin. Dan retired from college teaching after 37 years to enjoy the outdoors in Florida and to write and perform folk music, much of it at the Eustis Street Grill. He spent the bulk of his teaching career as a professor of English at Furham College in Virginia, but he has also taught African American literature and American literature at the University of Central Florida. He and his wife Martha live in Daytona Beach Shores and are members of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ormond Beach, where he serves as co-chair of the worship committee. To kick off our service, Dan would like to call us to worship. The call to worship will be followed by one of Dan's musical pieces. Dan?
Thanks, Henry. Our call to worship this morning comes from Howard University professor Kenyatta R. Gilbert. He writes, "The preaching tradition that the early Black clergy fashioned would have profound impact on Dr. Martin Luther King's moral and ethical vision. They linked the vision of Jesus Christ, as stated in the Bible, of bringing good news to the poor and recovery of sight to the blind, and of proclaiming liberty to the captives. Link that with the Hebrew prophet's mandate of speaking truth to power. Thus it was that Dr. King brought prophetic interpretation to brutal racism, to Jim Crow segregation, and to poverty in the 1950s and 60s. Indeed, Dr. King's prophetic vision ultimately invited his martyrdom. But through the prophetic preaching tradition already well established by his time, King brought people of every tribe, class, and creed closer toward forming God's beloved community, an anchor of love and hope for humankind."
The whole wide world sings one sweet song, can you hear it? Relax and let your ragtime rhythm roll. The notes come each by each, like shells upon the beach. A melody that's written on your soul. One sweet song, there's no way to sing it wrong. Spirit flowing through us runs so strong. One sweet song, won't you stay and sing along? Together we can harmonize till dawn. The world comes on like a big bad wolf, don't fear it. Just pick your path and toss that dog a bone. If he huffs and puffs at you, well, let him huff till he turns blue. Your business ain't nobody's but your own. One sweet song, there's no way to sing it wrong. Spirit flowing through us runs so strong. One sweet song, won't you stay and sing along? Together we can harmonize till dawn. When other currents pull too strong and start to bully me along, well, I've got to find the strength to paddle free. 'Cause there's a wondrous life to live, a chance to take, a chance to give, and I'm bound to take a chance on being me. The song we sing can heal the heart, can you feel it? The music moves us with its soothing touch. A lullaby at night, even the blues can set us right. Sounds so true, we just can't get enough of that one sweet song. There's no way to sing it wrong. The spirit flowing through us runs so strong. One sweet song, won't you stay and sing along? Together we can harmonize till dawn. The whole wide world is singing one sweet song. It's been so good to know you now, so long.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. That was a wonderful tune. Welcome all to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Lake County. We are an inclusive, non-creedal fellowship that works for a just community and fosters a lifelong search for personal spiritual fulfillment. We celebrate diversity of religious experiences and spiritual practices. We are Unitarian Universalists, UUs. Here, we welcome you no matter your personal or religious background, no matter your age, your gender, your ethnicity, or your sexual orientation. Here, we honor the inherent worth and dignity of every person and every being. We support one another in our search for truth and meaning in our lives. We have no creed, but are guided by Unitarian Universalist principles, which can be found on our website or the website of the Unitarian Universalist Association. We're truly glad each and every one of you are here. If you are a first-time visitor, or perhaps returning after an absence, and if you are comfortable doing so, we invite you to wave your hand at the camera so we can see you, and a member of our tech staff will call on you. You may unmute yourself and introduce yourself if you like. Do we have anyone like that?
Hi. Hi, I'm Amy Jenkins. I'm new. I haven't actually joined. I've just been coming to the Zoom meetings past couple of weeks.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Amy. Anyone else? All right, well, to all of our visitors, we're honored by your presence here and hope you will come again. If you're interested in learning more about Unitarian Universalism or our community here at UUCLC, please call the church office 352-805-8451 or send us an email at office@lakecountyuu.net. Someone from our membership committee will get back to you. This is a chalice today. The lighting of our chalice is a moment shared by Unitarian Universalist congregations. This ritual connects us to each other throughout the country and even around the world. I will light the small candle in this little kitty candle holder here. As a representation of our chalice, let's give that a whirl. I don't know if you can see the flame. It's a relatively small flame. I think it's an interesting flame. The flame is colored such that it's inviting. We like that color. It's warm. It flickers and waves in the wind like flexibility, and we all have to be flexible. It's bright. It lights the way. This is a representation of what our chalice does for us. And you know, the flame needs nutrients. It needs fuel. It needs oxygen, just like we do. The flame cannot defend itself. It doesn't fight back. It can be suffocated by oppressive forces. Similarities to us. I'd like to share the words of Vince Bass from the UU Words for Worship. Every day brings struggle. Every day brings joy. Every day brings us the opportunity to ease the struggle of another. To be the joy in another's life, may this flame remind us to carry out light, our light, to each other and to the world. Now let's sing together Spirit of Life, which you will see on the screen. It's now time for joys and concerns. We make time for those who wish to offer a joy, concern, or sorrow, or to set an intention for the coming days. This portion of our service will not be recorded. If you have a joy, concern, or sorrow that you wish to share, please wave your hand so a member of our tech staff can see it. After we call on you, please unmute your audio and briefly share your personal joy or concern. Being mindful of the joys and concerns we have just heard, please find a comfortable posture and in a moment, let the music draw you into mindfulness. We'll now share the congregational covenant, which you'll see on the screen. I don't know if everyone's done with the covenant, but I think we probably are. So we'll move on to our message from Dan.
There, I think I'm unmuted. Let me just begin by saying I really look forward to being with you in your building, and I'll look out for falling speakers. And we'll look forward to dining with you afterward next time. I'm going to talk to you today about slave narratives, material from slave narratives. If you're interested in following up, this volume is in the Library of America series, and I'll be mentioning it one more time, but this was edited by Henry Louis Gates, and a friend of mine from graduate school, and I recommend the volume to you highly. There's a tremendous variety to these, and so Henry Louis Gates and Bill Andrews have done a credit to us by editing these. If we look at today's bestseller list, we're certain to find thrillers of one sort or another close to the top. Back in the 18th century in North America, captivity narratives were the best-selling thrillers. The captive in the story was almost always a woman who'd been carried off after an attack by Native American raiders. She was dragged out of her house, abducted on horseback, and subjected to poor treatment. But somehow, if she was lucky, she evaded her captors, escaping to tell her breathtaking story. In the 19th century, a different sort of captivity narrative began to appear. The enslavement of men and women abducted from their homes in Africa and sold to Americans was now commonplace. And their mistreatment by the worst of those owners was common knowledge. The story of a slave subjected to such treatment was in itself inherently dramatic, since the people who held life and death dominion over them were called slave drivers for good reason. A typical slave narrative is the first-person story of a slave who, in the face of terrible abuse, risks everything in attempting to escape. To be sure, it's a minor miracle that anyone escaped a southern plantation to tell his or her story. Here's a partial list of the inherent dangers that the escaped slave would encounter. First, the escapee would be hunted down by a sheriff's posse using a pack of dogs for tracking. Should the escaped slave beat the odds by crossing swamps, streams, or rivers to throw the dogs off the scent, he or she faced a different sort of survival ordeal. To reach a free state might require a person to cover hundreds of miles, exposed to the elements and desperate to find food. Add to that the necessity of avoiding bounty hunters, empowered by laws such as the Fugitive Slave Act, and the odds on a successful escape became very long indeed. And yet, as William Lloyd Garrison wrote, it took whips, chains, thumb screws, paddles, bloodhounds, overseers, drivers, and patrols to keep the slaves down. A story that would dramatize the plight of a slave attempting to escape, a story of survival against the elements, a story of outsmarting the pursuers. That story certainly has all the trappings of a gripping tale. But how was such a story to get written in a nation in which slaves were forbidden by law to be educated to read and write? There are two factors to consider here. First, we encounter the miraculous ingenuity and resiliency of human beings determined to seek an education. When Frederick Douglass was moved from the farm to live with a family in Baltimore, he had some basic lessons from a kindly person within the new owner's household. That was a huge advantage. Our second factor, besides the hunger for literacy on the part of the slave, was the remarkable effort of people of goodwill to oppose the evil that infected the country by exposing the brutality that slavery was imposing upon their fellow human beings. It was often through the efforts of abolitionists that slaves were aided in their attempts to escape and to establish new lives in free states. And it was often through the efforts of abolitionists that these stories of escape and survival were published. When they did see print, they were indeed bestsellers. I've mentioned Frederick Douglass as one slave who had some help in securing an education, but much of his effort to learn to read and write took place out on the street, where he would bribe kids his age to help him to understand what he was seeing on the printed page. He made the most of this makeshift education. His 1845 autobiography is perhaps the most famous of the slave narratives. And the impact of that book was amplified by his effectiveness as an orator on the anti-slavery lecture circuit. Citing Douglass's example, Henry Louis Gates has said that in literacy lay true freedom for the Black slave. Of the more than 60,000 slaves who escaped to the North, more than 100 wrote book-length slave narratives, some with the aid of abolitionist ghostwriters, by the end of the Civil War. If we move forward nearly a century, by the end of World War II, more than 6,000 ex-slaves had narrated their stories, many of them in interviews conducted under the auspices of the WPA in the 1930s. Frederick Douglass begins his autobiography by stating that his mother was a field hand that he knew only from infrequent visits that she paid to his bedside at night. She died when he was 7 years old. He never saw her by the light of day. Douglass was unsure whether the plantation owner was his father or not. Typically, when the owner sired a son by a slave woman, the child would be sold away from the plantation to avoid complications like the owner having to order his own child to be flogged. In describing life on the plantation where he remained while he was young, Douglass observes that the horses were treated infinitely better than the slaves. A horse would not be flogged or shot for committing an alleged disobedient act. I say alleged because a female slave of Douglass's acquaintance was beaten to death by the wife of the master for not acting quickly enough to silence the master's baby when the child cried out in the middle of the night. Indeed, in spite of the myth of moonlight and magnolia surrounding southern plantations, slavery was a system that often turned the landowner and his family into murderers and torturers. One more reason that slavery deserves to be called America's original sin. As I mentioned earlier, Douglass had the good fortune to be sent from the farm to be the slave of a family in Baltimore. His ingenious efforts to secure an education there were something of a mixed blessing, however. He writes, "I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own." These were the thoughts of the man who would become one of the greatest orators of his generation, a tireless advocate for the abolition of slavery. His desire to be free was his guiding principle, and he worked tirelessly for the day when all slaves would be freed. But having been sent back to the country from Baltimore, Douglass was eventually subjected to the cruelty of a man named Covey, who specialized in breaking the will of slaves. This section of the autobiography is perhaps the most dramatic, for in it, Douglass admits that Covey succeeded in breaking him down to a brutal state. In that brutal condition, the 16-year-old Douglass decides to kill or be killed. We get a blow-by-blow account of a 2-hour, no-holds-barred, hand-to-hand combat between Douglass and Covey. Having defeated Covey and his assistant, Douglass expected that there would be immediate retaliation. His only explanation for why Covey didn't turn him over to the authorities for raising a hand against a white man, an offense punishable by death, was that Covey's reputation as a slave breaker might have suffered if it became generally known that he had lost this hand-to-hand battle with a slave. So how did Douglass eventually escape? From the 1845 autobiography, we do not know. We know that he was returned from the farm to Baltimore, where he was trained in exhausting work of replacing the caulking on ships in the harbor. But we do not learn from his slave narrative how he escaped, because he did not want to tip off the authorities as to his successful method, since other slaves might be using that very method. Douglass was, in fact, very critical of Henry Brown for including details about his own escape in his published narrative. But actually, Henry Brown might have inspired others to adopt his method. I say that because earlier this year, while under house arrest in Japan, Carlos Ghosn, the former CEO of Nissan Motors, seems to have taken a page out of Henry Brown's book by concealing himself in a large box intended for the transporting of musical equipment in order to secretly move from the airport terminal in Osaka to a private jet that whisked him away to his native Lebanon. Carlos Ghosn clearly has Henry Box Brown, as he became known, to thank for carrying out the initial shipping box escape and writing about it in his very popular slave narrative. So let me back up for a second. On the journey north toward Massachusetts, New York, or Canada from Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, Maryland, or Virginia, it was not unusual for an escaped slave to enlist the help of a boat captain in order to reach the port of Philadelphia. There, the Quaker community would provide the escapee with food, shelter, and clothing for the continued journey north. The arrival of Henry Brown in Philadelphia was more than a bit unusual, however, in that the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society conspired with Brown's friends back in Richmond, Virginia, to arrange his unique escape. On March 29, 1844, a wooden box addressed to the Quaker merchant Passmore Williamson was presented to the office of the Adams Express Company. The box measured 3 feet by 2 feet by 2 2/3 feet. Inside it was squeezed the aforementioned Henry Brown. In order to get sent home from his slave job in a tobacco factory that morning, Brown had purposely spilled sulfuric acid on his hand. 27 hours after the box was mailed, it arrived at Adams Express in Philadelphia. That was 27 hours during which this precursor of the Amazon Prime delivery had traveled by wagon, railroad, steamboat, and ferry. As the package sat on the loading dock at Adams Express, Box Brown, as he would thereafter be known, emerged from his confined quarters to recite a psalm that he had memorized for the occasion. "Welcome, Mr. Brown, to the city of brotherly love." The confinement of Harriet Jacobs lasted not 27 hours, but 7 years. Published in 1861 under the title Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Jacobs's detailed account of her life was one of the first slave narratives written from the point of view of a woman. As such, it gave America an inside look at the sexual harassment and abuse visited by slave owners upon their female slaves. Speaking of women, we might pause for a moment to consider what Jacobs has to say about the wife of Dr. Flint, her harasser. I'm going to read from this volume called Slave Narratives. It's page 758 exactly. Mrs. Flint, like many Southern women, was totally deficient in energy. She had not strength to superintend her husband's affairs, but her nerves were so strong that she could sit in an easy chair and see a woman whipped till the blood trickled from every stroke of the lash. She was a member of the church, but partaking of the Lord's Supper did not seem to put her in a Christian frame of mind. If dinner was not served at the exact time on that particular Sunday, she would station herself in the kitchen and wait till it was dished, and then spit in all the kettles and pans that had been used for cooking. She did this to prevent the cook and her children from eking out their meager fare with the remains of the gravy and other scrapings. The slaves could get nothing to eat except what she chose to give them. Provisions were weighed out by the pound and ounce 3 times a day. I can assure you she gave them no chance to eat wheat bread from her flour barrel. She knew how many biscuits a quart of flour would make and exactly what size they ought to be. The rest of that chapter further documents the murderous cruelty of women toward women, an account of which I will gladly spare you. As for Dr. Flint, the husband of this woman, Harriet Jacobs knew that he had fathered at least 10 children on his female slaves. She was determined not to become his next victim. Chapter 7 of her narrative dramatizes her confrontation with him over the question of whether the man she loved, a freedman in town who was earning a good living as an accomplished carpenter, could buy her freedom in order to marry her. Dr. Flint declares that if she marries anyone, it will be one of his slaves. When Jacobs insists upon her right to marry the man she loves, she receives a blow to the head and a threat to be killed or jailed. Discretion being the better part of valor, Harriet Jacobs decided to disappear from Dr. Flint's household. He subsequently went to great lengths to make life miserable for anyone as he tried to ferret her out. Ultimately, after jailing her 2 children, he put them up for auction and sold them. Fortunately, the purchase of the children was carried out in such a way to allow their father, the carpenter, to secure their freedom. Jacobs tells us in her book that this fact alone set her free in her own mind. Her narrative continues with an account of her subsequent escape through the swamps and her 7 years of hiding in the attic of the home of her grandmother. Eventually, she arrived with her children in the free state of New York, where dodging bounty hunters must have seemed like a piece of cake compared to her previous adventures. I'd like to conclude with the story of Annie L. Burton, who wrote a slave narrative which has been transcribed and archived at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It concerns the first night that she and her 4 siblings were able to spend with their mother after the mother liberated them from the plantation where she herself had worked as a slave. The mother had fled the plantation after emancipation, but in a cruel twist of fate, she was not allowed to take her children with her. A mother's will is a formidable force, as all of us know. This mother demonstrated her determination by returning surreptitiously one night after 4 years of scrambling to survive in the post-war economy. On that night, she stole back her 4 children. The mother had discovered a small hut quite a ways up the road where she could shelter the children while she went off to work for a white family during the day. The weather turned nasty as she returned to the hut after work, but she was able to build a fire in the stove, and so she set about preparing a meal with a small quantity of food she'd been able to cobble together. Here's what her daughter Annie remembered about that first night. We 5 children were eagerly waiting the pot boiling with the peas and ham bone. The rain was pattering on the roof of the hut. All at once there came a knock at the door. My mother answered the knock. When she opened the door, there stood a white woman and 3 little children, all dripping with the rain. My mother said, "In the name of the Lord, where are you going on such a night with these children?" The woman said, "Auntie, I'm traveling. Will you please let me stop here tonight out of the rain with my children?" My mother said, "Yes, honey. I ain't got much, but what I have got, I will share with you." The woman responded, "God bless you." The 2 women fell to talking, each telling a tale of woe. "Honey, ain't you got no husband?" my mother asked. The woman said, "No, my husband got killed in the war." My mother replied, "Well, my husband died right after the war. I've been away from my little brood for 4 years. With a hard struggle, I have got them away from the Farron plantation, for they did not want to let them go. But I got them. With God's help, I will keep them from starving." The white woman replied, "Auntie, my husband left me on a rich man's plantation. This man promised to look out for me until my husband came home, but he got killed in the war. And the man said he could not help me anymore, and we would have to do the best we could for ourselves. I gave my things to a woman to keep for me until I could find my kinsfolk. They live about 50 miles from here up in the country. I'm on my way there now." My mother said, "How long will it take you to get there?" "About 3 days if it don't rain." My mother said, "Ain't you got some way to ride there?" She said, "No, Auntie, there's no way riding up where my folks live, the place where I'm from." "Have you all had anything to eat?" my mother asked. "We stopped at a house about dinner time, but the woman didn't have anything but some bread and buttermilk." My mother said, "Well, honey, I ain't got but a little, but I will divide with you." The woman said, "Thank you, Annie. You just give my children a little. I can do without." Then came the dividing. Now, this is from the daughter's point of view. We all watched with our eyes wide to see what the shares would be. My mother broke a mouthful of bread and put it on each of the tin plates. Then she took the old spoon and equally divided the pea soup. We children were seated around the fire with some little wooden spoons, but the wooden spoons didn't quite go round, and some of us had to eat with our fingers. Our share of the meal, however, was so small that we were as hungry when we finished as when we began. Then we all lay down on the straw, the white children with us, and my mother covered us over with a blanket. We were soon in the land of Nod, forgetting our empty stomachs. The 2 mothers still continued to talk, sitting down on the only seats, a couple of wooden blocks. And then, backs against the wall, my mother and the white woman slept. We've considered the plight of slave women through the case of Annie Burton and Harriet Jacobs. What about that other Harriet, the one who ran the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman? She returned dozens of times from the North in order to help others to accomplish their escapes. But that's a story for another day. And when you think about it, somebody ought to make a movie about that.
Come a time. There'll come a time when the folks who are going hungry will be fed, when the stones that block our path will turn to bread. Oh, the songs that we will sing, the harvests we will bring. There'll come a time, don't you know, there'll come a time. There'll come a time when the children will find shelter from the cold, The pariah will be welcomed to the fold. A new circle will be drawn, voices raised in grateful song. There'll come a time, don't you know, there'll come a time. There'll come a time when the heart will be our touchstone, when the graceful dove will soar in peaceful flight. There'll come a time when the hand once raised in anger will rock the cradle through the stormy night. There'll come a time when the wounds of our planet will be healed, when the creatures of the forest and the field will multiply and thrive. What a time to be alive. There'll come a time, don't you know, there'll come a time. The hungry will be fed and the children tucked in bed. The world's artillery will rust in memory, and the silent battlefield to 1,000 songbirds yield. There'll come a time, don't you know, there'll come a time.
Are we ready for a benediction?
Yes, go ahead, Dan.
Our benediction comes to us from Parker Palmer, who writes, "Fear is so fundamental to the human condition that all the great spiritual traditions originate in an effort to overcome its effects on our lives. With different words, they all proclaim the same core message: be not afraid. Though the traditions vary widely in the ways they propose to take us beyond fear, all hold out the same hope. We can escape fear's paralysis and enter a state of grace where encounters with otherness will not threaten us, but will enrich our work and our lives. May it be so."
And thank you so much, Dan, for your uplifting message, music, and closing words.
It's wonderful to be with you.
Very good. It's now time for all of us to reflect on how we continue our presence here. We are so fortunate to have a UU congregation family to support each and every one of us. In order to continue our virtual services, keep our beautiful building protected, and ready for our eventual return, we ask for whatever financial support you can provide. There are multiple means to do this, all of which are found in the Sunday Service Bulletin or our UUCLC website. You can also donate from the link in the chat box right now. Thank you for your donation today. And now I'll extinguish the chalice. There's the chalice. You see the flame? Here are words from Martha L. Munson from UU Words for Worship. We extinguish the chalice here that it might glow gently in our hearts. May it light your path as you leave this place. May it guide your way until we are together again.